Quite some time now we have been looking at the book of Revelation, and we have kind of hit a road mark, I guess if you will, a monumental place in the study where we're going to kind of move on to a new vision from here out to the rest of the book, really. Chapters 1 through 11 in Revelation go together. And then chapters 12 through 22 go together. And so chapters 11 and 12, right there at the end of 11, at the beginning of 12, that we're about to get into tonight, is kind of the dividing line of the book, okay? And you can honestly see it. If you look at the chapter there, it says that John received a sign, or that he saw a sign in heaven. And it almost has a feel, almost, of something new that he's about to receive. It says there a great sign appeared in heaven. And really when you get to studying it, it's something that's different and set apart from the previous visions. Because if you remember, really this whole time we've been studying that it began with the opening of the scrolls. If you remember, Jesus came up and he took the book out of the right hand of God in chapter 5. And then one by one started breaking those seals. Well, he broke seal number 6, and a question was posed. Who can stand? Well, chapter 7, he answers that question. Who can stand? The 144,000, the redeemed on earth can stand. Then seal number 7 is broken. Well, that transitions into 7 trumpets. Well, trumpets 1 through 6 are blown. And then again, you kind of have an interlude between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. Where we see the 2 witnesses and the measuring of the temple. And then you have the 7th trumpet blown, and that is the end of chapter 11. And you see how kind of that's one big rolling vision, how they kind of transition right into each other. Well, then in chapter 12, we begin by looking at a great sign, a new sign that John has been given in heaven. In chapter 12 here is a story. It's a story. Now, what I want to do is I want to first read the story, okay? And then we're going to talk about the story. We're going to talk about the high points in the general plot of the story, and then we're going to look at the characters, because in order for us to understand the story of chapter 12, we got to understand the characters that are in it. And once we understand the characters, then we'll be able to interpret the story that's given to us, okay? So first things first, we need to read the story, okay? Gene Stewart, why don't you read for us verses 1 through 4? Casey Hibbler, will you pick up and then read verses 5 all the way down to, if you'll read down to verse 10, and then I'll pick up and read the rest of the chapter. So Mr. Gene, will you read verses 1 through 4 for me, please?
A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child the moment it was born.
She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down.
Read 2 more verses. Read through 12.
And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell within him, in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time.
And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus Christ. That's the story, okay? It's a story in chapter 12 of a woman, a pregnant woman who was about to give birth. And if you look there in verse 2, it says that she cried out in pain because she was about to give birth. And as she was about to give birth, the great red dragon in verse 4 was about to destroy her child. And then she gave birth to the child, and the dragon was unable to destroy the child. And after she gave birth, she fled to the wilderness where she was protected by God, verse 6. And then war in heaven broke out. And the dragon with his angels were cast down. The dragon tried to persecute the woman who had fled off into the wilderness, but he failed to do so. The woman was able to escape his persecution, and then the dragon, after he realized he was not able to persecute her any longer, goes off to persecute the rest of her children. That's the story. The story that's laid out in Revelation chapter 12 here. Now, already you can kind of tell, like we could probably get some pretty good educated guesses of what this story is talking about. But for us to better understand exactly what this story is, and we're going to roll back through it at the end of this, we need to understand the characters involved. The characters involved. Who is our first character that we're introduced to? Go back to verse 1.
The woman.
Do what?
The woman.
The woman. We're first introduced to the woman. Now I want you to notice a couple of things about her. And first things first, it says that the woman gave birth to a son, right? A male child who was caught up to heaven. Who can guess who that is?
Jesus.
Jesus Christ. Okay, we're going to get to more of that here in just a little bit, but I need to dispel something. Just go ahead, say it right up front, okay? This is not Mary. Okay? This is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. First of all, we see here that Mary the woman is described as having been persecuted. She was heavily persecuted, and the dragon sought after her. And even after she gave birth to the child, the dragon tried to persecute her, chased her down, tried to have the flood waters swallow her up, and the earth helped the woman to escape the persecution. And so we have no, and I mean no, biblical or extra-biblical evidence that shows any persecution of any kind for Mary, the mother of Jesus. Okay, so it can't be Mary. Also, it says there in verse 17 that when the great dragon failed to persecute the woman, that he went after the rest of her children. Well, we have no evidence of persecution of any kind of the brothers of Jesus Christ. We just simply don't. We just simply don't. We do not. And so, the woman cannot be a reference to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Okay? And let's try to figure out her identity. And I've got my opinion. And there are some people who do think it's Mary, the mother of Jesus. However, I don't think it fits. Okay? This is my opinion. Okay? And really, I'll show you at the end of the chapter that it really doesn't matter. It does not take away from the interpretation of the passage at all. Okay? And I'll prove that to you as we go throughout the chapter and as we round everything up. Notice that it says there that she is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. So she's clothed with the sun. So it's the sun and the brightness of the sun that she's clothed with, and the moon is under her feet. You see, that is a picture of glory. And the church is seen as dressed in glory. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 27. That he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Also, go back to verse 2 there. And what does it say there in verse 2, or I'm sorry, in verse 1, that she has on her head? A crown of what?
12 stars.
12 stars. A crown of 12 stars. Hang on just a second. I got to turn my iPad keeps shutting off because it's in low power mode. There we go. A crown of 12 stars on her head. More than likely a reference to the 12 apostles. Because when we think of the foundation of the church, who founded the church first and foremost? Who did that come to first, I guess I should say? Because who founded it? Jesus the Christ is the cornerstone. But who is it built upon? The 12 apostles. The 12 apostles. And we are being built up into a holy household, a holy priesthood. So the crown of 12 stars more than likely is a reference to the 12 apostles on which the church was built. Okay? And so, more than likely, and this is my opinion, is that the woman represents the church. The woman represents the church. Now, you don't really see it much in her giving birth to the child, and I'm going to talk about that, and it's a contradiction. I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. You don't really see it much, but where you really see it is in the persecution of the dragon. Okay, go back to verse 6 with me real quick. Look at verse 6. Somebody tell me how long she was to be persecuted by the dragon.
1260 days.
What's that?
1260.
1260. Okay. Does anybody recognize that number? Anybody at all?
It was like
Go back to the last chapter. Go back to chapter 11. Look at chapter 11 and verse 3. Chapter 11 and verse 3. I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now again, as we were looking last week at chapter 11, and as we concluded the chapter up, I guess this would be 2 weeks ago as we concluded the chapter up, we came to the realization that the 2 witnesses are more than likely the 2 apostles, or the 12 apostles. And the 12 apostles and their witnessing there is symbolized of the workings of the church, the existence of the church on earth. And so as long as the 12 apostles are allowed to work, that's the reference there in verse 3 of the 2 witnesses prophesying. Because do we not have the work of the apostles right here? Do we not have this? Because you think of where truth came from. All truth came from the Father, right? Given to the Son. The Son sent the Holy Spirit to bring to remembrance all that He had said to them, John chapter 16 and verse 13. And that was given to the apostles. And then truth was written down and given to us. And so when you look at how truth came down to mankind, in which we have it right here, the idea of the two witnesses, or the 12 apostles, prophesying for 1260 days is the 12 apostles, or the New Testament, speaking to us, the church, for 1260 days. And so you cross-reference that with Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6, in 1,260 days. We're talking about the length of the church, is what we're talking about. And so, again, if you try to fit that, if you try to wormhole that in to say, well, this is Mary, well, then how can you explain Mary being persecuted for 1,260 days? It doesn't really fit. However, the church in other passages in the book of Revelation is being referenced to operating on earth for 1,260 days. Well, now go back to verse 6 again, and it says, the woman fled into the wilderness. And we're going to get some more of that in just, give me 2 seconds, we'll get into that. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 29. No one hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ also does the church. And so you see in Ephesians 5:29, it says that Christ nourishes the church. The woman fled to the wilderness for this same length of time that the church is in operation to be nourished. Now, then we think about the symbolism of being fled or fleeing into the wilderness. What is the relationship between Israel and the Christian? What are we? Are we actual Jews, or what are we referred to as it relates to Israel?
They lived in the wilderness for 40 years.
They lived in the wilderness for 40 years. That's exactly right. Well,
Spiritual.
we are
Israel.
spiritual Israel, right? Okay? So, Pharaoh's already one step ahead of me. Did Israel not go to the wilderness? And did God not care for them in the wilderness? Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say that Christians are grafted in. They're
Yes.
grafted in.
Yes, exactly. Romans chapter 11. We are grafted into the tree. That's exactly right. The branch had to fall off, and the Gentiles are grafted into the tree, and that's exactly right. And so Christians are representative of spiritual Israel, grafted into the tree. And as Israel fled into the wilderness, did they not flee from Egypt? And while in the wilderness, what did they eat? What did God give them to eat?
Manna.
Manna. And what would Jesus say? I'm the
Bread.
bread. That's right. That's exactly right. Do you see the nourishment? Do you see the correlation between the two? It says, fled into the wilderness, much like the children of Israel. I've got it up here. The child. I don't have it up there. Also, when it talks about the idea of fleeing into the wilderness, Exodus mentions that God bore them out and nourished them and cared for them as He would, as the children of Israel were out into the wilderness. And so what you see there is you see a picture of a woman who gives birth to Jesus, to this son, right? And the dragon tries to prevent the birth. And we'll get to the child in just a second. The dragon tries to prevent the birth. But then even then still, after the birth is done and the male child is taken up into heaven, the devil still tries to persecute her. Well, she goes into the wilderness. It says there that it's a place prepared by God, verse 6. Did God not prepare the wilderness, Mount Sinai, for the children of Israel? And so there's a correlation between God preparing and nourishing the children of Israel and God nourishing the church. So, this is my opinion, okay? My opinion is that the woman here represents the church. She represents the church. Now, I understand that there's a contradiction there. Because who does the woman give birth to?
Jesus.
In the story, right here. Jesus, right? Well, who came first? Jesus or the church?
Jesus.
Jesus came first, right? And then the church. And so there's a problem with that interpretation. But again, there's a problem with interpreting it as Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well. Yes, sir.
Could there be any correlation with, when the Magi went to the birth of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and they went back another way because Herod was looking to kill him?
Yeah. You're talking about when the dragon tried to kill the child.
Well, I don't know that was it, but could that have some correlation or reference in there that?
Oh, no, you're talking about to the persecution of Mary. You're saying
pursue her.
If the woman represented Mary,
Yeah,
then the persecution could represent her fleeing from Nazareth to go or Bethlehem. I'm sorry, because she was in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Actually, she was in Bethlehem for probably up to 2 years. Because I think the assumption is that Mary probably assumed that that's where the king needed to grow up, was Bethlehem. Herod the Great would persecute persecute Jesus, try to kill Jesus. And so they would flee off into Egypt. And then Herod the Great would die. And then Mary would come back with Joseph and Jesus. And then when they came back, they didn't come back to Bethlehem, they came back to Nazareth. Could be a reference there somewhere. Yes, sir, Casey, do you have something?
Well, I mean, if you think of it as the woman being God's chosen people, I mean, if you go back, the Jews brought forth Jesus, and then, of course, after Jesus died, the church became God's chosen people.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the same concept there.
It could be
I
that
mean,
too.
it fits that way too.
It could be that too. And it would fit there because it would also say, that would also fit with her other children. And see, that's a problem with interpreting the woman as the church, is because the devil would go off to persecute her other children, and then if it's the church, then who's the other children? Well, you have to say that that's also the church as well. So either way, some of these interpretations, not any one of them fits perfectly. It's really difficult to distinguish between or to try to figure out who the woman is. In fact, if you take 10 commentaries on Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6, just Revelation 12 in general, and try to figure out who the woman is, you're probably going to get 10 completely different answers. And again, I'll show you here in a little bit that the interpretation just flat does not matter to the overall message. Okay? All right. Now this one's an easy one. The child. I know exactly who the child is. That's an easy one. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 5. Look there with me. It says that she gave birth to a son, a male child. And that male child would rule all nations with a rod of iron. That's a quotation, by the way, Old Testament quotation. Psalm chapter 2, verse 9. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. The prophecy of the Christ. And so, the child, a male child, rule all nations with a rod of iron. It says there that he was caught up to God and to his throne. Well, where did Jesus go? Luke 24:51. While he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 says, when he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And so the child is an easy concept. The child is Jesus Christ. Now if you look there, and this is what Gene brought up just a second ago, is that the male child, the dragon tried to devour the child. Go back to verse 4. And it says, his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her. Okay? Matthew 2:16. When Herod the Great, saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and its vicinity from 2 years old and under, which is why we assume that Mary and Joseph had lived in Bethlehem for roughly 2 years, because that's given the math that Herod the Great was given. He just went ahead and just swept 2 years and under. So Jesus could have been up to 2 years old, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. So that right there is a clear reference in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 4 to Satan trying to devour the child. He tried to have Jesus killed, murdered, whenever he was a child. And so the child is an easy one. And then also the dragon is an easy one. This one's an easy one because it's actually given for us. If you look at verse 9 there, it says, the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan. It's interpreted for us right there. Who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And so the dragon, who's called the devil of old, the deceiver, John 8:44, whenever he speaks a lie. He speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And so that's the dragon. The dragon, again, is an easy one to interpret. But there's an interesting passage in here where our minds can run away with the fanciful and the mystical. And that is when war broke out in heaven. Let's read together verse 7 and 8 again, just very quickly. In verse 7 and 8 it says, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down. So, John, through inspiration of Scripture, gives us a glimpse into heaven. Now, here's the problem, okay? Here's the problem. All the rest of this text, is it literal or figurative?
It's figurative.
Do what?
It's figurative.
It's figurative. It talks about this woman, right? This woman who is about to give birth, and the male child is actually literal, but it's still spoken of. He's still spoken of in a figurative sense, and the persecution of the woman and the persecution of the other children. These are things in the figurative. Well, right smack dab in the middle of that, we get a glimpse of something that possibly, more than likely, happened in heaven. Now, here's the thing, and this is where we kind of get our mind wrapped around it. If you take this in a chronological order of the chapter, what has already happened is that the woman gave birth to the child. The child has already been taken up into heaven, and the woman is already in the wilderness in chapter 6. Then war breaks out in heaven in verse 7. Do you see that? So you can't take the chapter in chronological order. More than likely what John is doing is John is giving you a snippet, a little insert there to say, oh, by the way, this happened. And when did that happen? We see the world created in Genesis chapter 1, and who's there in Genesis chapter 3? Satan. Satan's there. So somewhere between Genesis chapter 1 and day 6, when God looked at everything, it says he looked at all that he created. He said, it is good, including who? Satan. And then all of a sudden Genesis chapter 3 comes along, and there he is, okay? It's my personal opinion that this is a literal story of something that really happened. That's just my opinion. Your salvation does not depend upon it. But I truly believe that this is an insert of something that really happened that John stuck in there and said, by the way, the angel waged war with Michael and his angels. And the dragon and his angels, there was no place found for them in heaven. Which, by the way, speaks a little bit of in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 12. Put on the full armor of God, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Possibly a reference to Satan, and who had at one time existed in heaven. Now, I want you to notice the praise that erupts in heaven when the devil is cast down to the earth. Notice the praise in verse 10. It says, then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. All right, pause for just a second. What's he talking about? Salvation, power, kingdom. Is that before or after the cross?
After.
Do what?
After.
After. Salvation, power, kingdom, that's after the cross. Okay? And authority of his Christ have come. All authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth, Jesus Christ would say in Matthew chapter 28. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, meaning he's very angry, and knowing that he has only a short time. Meaning be on your guard, be on the alert. Your adversary prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour, and he knows that he does not have a long time on this earth. Now, it says there that when he was cast down, when he was thrown down to the earth, look at what it says in verse 13. And this is why it doesn't necessarily fit with Israel being the woman, although I have to admit Israel would make sense in the progression of where Jesus would come from. But it says here in verse 13, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Past tense. So, he comes down to the earth and he tries to persecute the woman. Notice what it says there in verses 13 through 16 of what he tries to do to the woman. So he tries to persecute the woman. Look what it says in verse 14. It says, the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place. That's the second time it mentions to her place. Have you caught that? Go back to verse 6. Woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God. Verse 14. The 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. You may want to underline times, and half a time, and I'll get to that in just a second. That's actually a quote from Daniel. But I want you to notice that he says, Satan, the devil, he tries to persecute the woman. And the woman was given. Notice that she was given 2 wings of the great eagle. There in verse 14. It was almost like a gift to her. And I wonder where that gift came from. This is the verse I was looking for, by the way. I knew in my mind I had a verse from Exodus up here that I was going to reference. Okay? When Israel was brought out of Egypt into the wilderness, it is described over and over and over again, all throughout your Old Testament, as bearing you out on eagle's wings. Anybody recognize that? A bunch of times it's in the Old Testament. Israel is brought out of Egypt, borne out on eagle's wings. It says, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. What does that mean? That when did God bring them to himself? When was that? Or where was that, I should say? Where was that when God said, I brought you to myself? Where was that? Mount Sinai. That's exactly right. He brought them out of Egypt, brought them into the wilderness, brought them to Mount Sinai, and he says, I bring you to myself. That's where they met God, isn't it? Okay? Watch the correlation here, okay? Turn with me now to Hebrews chapter 12. The woman goes out into the wilderness, goes to a place prepared for her, right? Well, when you think about the children of Israel, they were brought out on eagle's wings, brought out into the wilderness, brought to a place prepared by God, brought to Mount Sinai. And there in the wilderness, they were nourished by God. And see, this is where I think the woman in the church fit perfectly. Because in Hebrews chapter 12, he says there, you have not come to a mountain. Look at verse 18. You, who's the you? Christians. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched, into a blazing fire, into darkness and gloom and whirlwind, blast of a trumpet and the sounds of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them. They could not even bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. So terrible was the sight that Moses said, I'm full of fear and trembling. What mountain is that?
Sinai.
Mount Sinai. Notice what he says of you, Christian. You haven't come to Mount Sinai. Verse 22, you've come to Mount Zion. Do you see the comparison? Do you see it? You have come up out of Egypt, out of sin. You have come to the wilderness where God nourishes you. The church, Jesus Christ, nourishes and cherishes the church. You have come to a place prepared by God, not Mount Sinai, but Mount Zion. And it's the exact same length of time that the woman was to be persecuted in Revelation 12:6, that the church was going to be on earth occupying or operating in Revelation 11:30.
This is what
Yes.
it says about the type.
Do what?
Talking about the type.
Yes, this is a type. Yes, I believe it is. This is my opinion that it is. Yes.
I forget, you know, that God led them by night by fire
Mhm.
and by cloud by day.
Yes.
And that's for protection. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Yes.
It goes right along.
Absolutely. Think of everything he did for them in the wilderness, providing the manna, providing when they got tired of manna, he gave them quail, and giving the water from the rock twice. I mean, think of everything that God did for them. That is a symbol of the nourishing of the church for a pretty long length of time, right? Well, 1,260 days is the symbolism of God nourishing the church
Until
here.
he comes again.
Do what?
Until he comes again.
Until he comes again.
I think it's the whole, it
Yes.
represents the church from now to the end of time.
Yes.
It's 1260 days.
Yes.
That's fine.
It just resembles the length of the church.
Yes.
And someday we'll stand up in heaven and realize what the 1260 days was symbolizing in the length of Jesus coming the first time and him coming the second time. But now, standing on earth, we don't know what 1260 represents. Nor do we know what 40 represents. The 40 days in the wilderness, the 40 days on the ark, the 40 days it rained. There's a lot of correlation there with the number 40. But I want you to notice too. So you see the correlation there between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. A woman fleeing into the wilderness to be nourished by God. Israel going out into the wilderness to be nourished by God. You see the correlation there, and the eagle's wings bearing them out. And God would say in Exodus 19 verse 4, to myself. In Revelation 12 it says, to a place prepared for her. Okay? But I want you to notice also, and of course I got this messed up on the slide, but in Revelation 12, 13 through 16, it says there that she is to be nourished for a time, times, and a half a time. Do y'all see that? I got to flip back over to Revelation because I don't see it either. Revelation chapter 12.
Verse
Look there in
14.
verse 14. Do what?
14.
14, thank you. Where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time. All right. This is again, I'm just racking up tally marks where I think the woman represents the church, okay? So we'll battle it out afterwards, okay? For those that don't think it represents the church. I'm teasing. So, you look at Daniel here. And what it says about Daniel in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25. Look what it says. He, our adversary, will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one. Who do you think that is? And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, which I'll get to the application of that in just a second, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. My word. Do you see the correlation? Do you see it? Our adversary is going to speak out against the Most High. Wear down the saints of the highest one. Who's he talking about? That's Jesus Christ. Saints of Jesus Christ, that's the church. That's the church of Christ. He will intend to make alterations in times and in law. Is not the greatest work of Satan making the slightest alterations to the Word of God? And so that we have such religious division that exists amongst us. And notice how long he's going to be doing it. Time, and half a time. An exact reference right here to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14 for the exact same amount of time that the church is going to be nourished, or the woman is going to be nourished. So do you see? The woman more than likely represents the church. And so what you see here is a story. And then once he fails at that in verse 17, he fails to persecute the woman. By the way, I didn't even talk about how he nourishes her. Notice what it says there in verse 15 and 16. He got mad when she was able to go out into the wilderness. Well, in verse 15 there, he tries to use the flood to sweep her away. Well, verse 16, the earth helped the woman. Did God help the woman, or did the earth help the woman? The earth helped. Well, who do you think caused the earth to help the woman? Don't all things work to good for them that love the Lord, to them that are called according to his purpose? Isn't that the church? Does God not care providentially for the church? We pray for people that are sick. We pray for people that are hurting. And does not God help us in ways that he himself is not directly touching our lives, but he is still shaping and changing our lives through providence, is it not? That's seen right here with the earth helped the woman. The earth helped the church through God in his providence. And so Satan, once he figured out that he failed to persecute the woman, that's when he shifts commands, or shifts his focus over here. And he says he goes out to wage war with the rest of her children. Verse 17. Who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. The rest of her children is an easy one to interpret too, isn't it? Those are the Christians. Those are the Christians. Now, let me show you why it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who the woman is. It doesn't matter of the interpretation of the other children. It doesn't matter of the timeline of when Satan was thrown out of heaven. It doesn't matter. None of those interpretations matter to the overall meaning of the text. Let me show you why right here. Satan failed to devour the child when he was born. Satan failed to prevent Christ from being caught up to God. Satan failed to prevent Christ from ruling the nations with a rod of iron. Satan failed, and he lost the war with Michael and his angels. Satan was cast out of heaven down to earth. Satan was unable to defeat the woman in the wilderness, and he's probably going to more than likely fail to defeat the rest of her children too, don't you think? Do you see what John is trying to get across in the message? It's right here. Satan failed. Satan was unable to do anything that he set out to do. He couldn't stop the child from being born. He couldn't stop the child from performing his mission on earth. He couldn't stop him from being caught up into heaven. He couldn't even win the war in heaven. He was cast out of heaven. He failed to persecute the early church. And he fails today in so many ways that we're not even aware of. He fails all the time. Why? Because God is on our side. That is the message that John is trying to get across in describing this story of a woman who was pregnant and with child, gave birth to the child. The child was caught up in heaven. The dragon, he waged a war in heaven and he lost. He tried to go persecute the woman and he loses. And so now he changes his focus to the rest of his children, which we're going to look at next week.